There are 25 decks in Vanguard Overdress right now. 30 if you count all the token Rambu decks. Here's a simple guide giving an overview of all the decks, and hopefully it'll help you find out which one you want to play. The first method I'm going to use to break down these decks are what nation they're in. Nations typically share support for each other, meaning if you get the cards for one, you already have some of the cards for another. Also, each nation really does have their own distinct playstyle. Keter Sanctuary is very generic, but it does have the unique gimmick of messing around with triggers and drive checks. Typically what you're going to be doing with this deck is having a few restanding large units. Dragon Empire is where most tempo and control decks are found. Dragon Empire decks usually have access to removal abilities and can play very well in the grind games. That's not to say they can't rush, but they're not as good at it as other nations are. Dark States is all about wombo combos. Every deck here cares about building a lot of soul and setting up for multi-attacks. These decks can really do basically anything, provided you have the right setup for it. Brentgate is a weird control aggro nation. Its 3 decks have access to extremely strong aggro rush abilities, while having access to good control effects too. This nation is home of the prison mechanic, easy board clearing, and a lot of countercharging. Storkea is the home of multi-attacking and graveyard synergy. The goal of a Storkea deck is typically to set up massive multi-attacks, while converting its units into value. Don't play Token Rambu, it's just weaker versions of all the other decks in the game. Lyrical Monasterio is the nation of value. Every lyrical deck is all about calling out a board of units and drawing a lot of cards. There's a lot of lyrical decks, so there's a lot of variety, but all lyrical decks like unit spamming, and most like easy combos to push for game. Now that we have an overview of the themes, let's break down what decks do individually. For this breakdown, I've split the decks into 5 types. Although because of the nature of Vanguard, this isn't always a clear distinction. First off, we have aggro decks. These are decks that like to play fast and start the game off, trying to deal as much damage as possible. Next up, we have combo decks. These decks are all about setting up a combo, and then you're just going to try to delete your opponent in one turn. Here we have the 2 pure control decks, and these are all about removing our opponent's units, and they don't really do a whole lot else. And that's the sad part about control decks this format. They've kind of got shafted, because I don't think Bushiroad really wants to deal with the lock mechanic coming back. Which is a shame, because lock is based. Here we have our tempo decks. These decks are all about buying time and controlling the flow of the game until you're ready to go all in. Lastly, we have hybrid decks that are a fusion of one or more style. For example, Seraph Snow combines aggro with control mechanics, and they have a bit of tempo too. Now that we know what each deck does, how good are they? Here are the worst decks in the game. These decks lack pressure, usually have ridiculous issues with getting to their end goal. These decks are still really fun, but I don't think they're going to consistently top any event. Here are the rogue or mid-tier decks. They're solid all around, but they're not going to be meta-defining. And lastly, here are the best decks in the game. If you're strictly a competitive player, I would consider picking one of these decks. Now let's go over how hard the decks are to pick up and play. This refers to both skill ceiling and skill floor, but I am weighing skill floor a bit higher. Here we have the easiest decks. These are decks that you can just pick up and play and fully understand how they work. If you're a newer player and you want to get into the game, you should pick up one of these. Here are the middle difficulty decks. These are some branching options in both gameplay and in deck building. A lot of these also have higher skill ceilings, so a good player can do a lot with them, but I don't think it's at all hard for a new player to pick up. Lastly, we have the harder decks to play. Some decks like Wallista have hard to use combos, some decks like Nirvana and Zerga require a lot of game knowledge to figure out what tempo you want to set, and lastly, some decks like Powerful and Token Rambu are just hard because they're bad. Lastly, I'm going to break down the price. For a lot of players, money is an issue. Here are the cheap decks. Notice a strong correlation between meta relevance and price. But if you're a new player looking to get into the game, picking up one of these cheaper decks is a good idea. Also notice Lorona Wool, which is a relevant deck, is pretty cheap. Here are the average costed decks. And here are the expensive decks that are going to cost you a lot. These usually have a lot of triple rares, and they could need expensive promos. Now, what decks do I recommend to a new player? I recommend Grade 3 Bruce if the new player likes combo. I recommend Gravidia if you like aggro, and I recommend Bags of Argra if you like slower games. And Kyrie and Laronarol are just good all-around cheap competitive options. In case you guys are wondering, these are what decks I personally play. I play Gravidia, Bruce, Bags of Argra, Seraph Snow, Eugene, and Wallista. Competitively, I focus on Grade 4 Bruce and Gravidia. Thanks for watching. I'm going to have a written out version of this video on the website, so it will be open to reference. The next video is also likely going to be a part of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier List series, although I might sneak in another Vanguard deck profile. See you next time.